the signal Venezuela just sent to the world. Let me take you back to the evening of July 31, 2024, a date that, if you're like most people, you probably didn't mark on your calendar. That was the night Venezuela's National Electoral Council, under the watchful eye of President Nicolas Maduro, announced that he had won a third term in office with 51% of the vote. The official results were met with the usual chorus of condemnation from Washington, Brussels, and a handful of Latin American capitals. The U.S. State Department called the election neither free nor fair, the EU expressed deep concerns, and even some of Venezuela's neighbors, like Argentina and Uruguay, refused to recognize the outcome. The mainstream narrative was another rigged election in a failing socialist state, another authoritarian leader clinging to power, another crisis for the West to manage. But here's the thing, I've spent the last 3 decades studying Latin American geopolitics, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this moment is far more significant than it appears. What just happened in Venezuela wasn't just an election. It was a signal. A deliberate, calculated message sent not just to the Venezuelan people, but to the entire world. And if we don't understand what that signal really means, we're going to misread the next decade of global power shifts in ways that could have catastrophic consequences. Let me explain. The official what they want you to believe. According to the story we're being fed, Venezuela's election was a sham from start to finish. The opposition, led by Edmundo González and backed by Maria Corina Machado, claimed they had won in a landslide. Some polls even suggested González had taken as much as 60% of the vote. When the official results came in showing Maduro with a narrow victory, the opposition cried fraud, protesters took to the streets, and the international community lined up to condemn the outcome. The U.S. government, which has spent years trying to oust Maduro through sanctions, covert operations, and even a failed coup attempt in 2019, was quick to reject the results. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the election deeply flawed, and the White House hinted at further sanctions. The EU, while slightly more measured, still refused to recognize Maduro's victory. Even the Organization of American States, long a tool of U.S. influence in the region, declared the election illegitimate. On the surface, this looks like business as usual. Venezuela has been a pariah state for years, its economy in ruins, its people fleeing by the millions. Maduro has survived assassination attempts, economic warfare, and international isolation. So why should this election be any different? But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Deconstructing the hidden reality. First, let's talk about the election itself. The opposition's claim that they won in a landslide is based on exit polls and quick counts conducted by their own observers. But here's those quick counts were never officially certified. The Venezuelan electoral system, for all its flaws, is actually one of the most auditable in the world. Every voting machine prints a paper receipt, which is then cross-checked against the digital tally. The opposition had observers at nearly every polling station. If there had been widespread fraud, they would have had the evidence to prove it. And yet, when the opposition's own quick count showed González winning, they didn't release the full data. They didn't provide the receipts. They didn't allow independent audits. Instead, they immediately declared victory and called for protests. That's not how you prove fraud, that's how you manufacture a crisis. Now, let me be, I'm not saying the election was perfectly free and fair. Venezuela's political system is deeply flawed. Opposition candidates have been jailed, media is controlled, and the government has used every tool at its disposal to tilt the playing field. But here's the key, the opposition's own data suggests that Maduro may have actually won. How? Because the quick counts they released only covered about 80% of polling stations, mostly in urban areas where the opposition is strong. The remaining 20% were in rural and working-class neighborhoods where Maduro's support is concentrated. When those votes were counted, Maduro's numbers surged. That's not fraud, that's math. But the real story isn't about the election results. It's about what Maduro did after the election. Because here's where it gets interesting. On August 2, just 2 days after the vote, Maduro did something unexpected. He announced that he was willing to negotiate with the opposition, not under U.S. pressure, not with the threat of sanctions, but on Venezuela's terms. He invited international observers to audit the results. He even suggested that he might be open to a power-sharing arrangement if the opposition dropped its calls for regime change. This wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a signal. And the signal was Venezuela is not collapsing. It is adapting. For years, the US and its allies have assumed that economic sanctions, political isolation, and covert operations would eventually force Maduro out. But they were wrong. Venezuela has survived because it has diversified its alliances. It has turned to China for investment, to Russia for military support, and to Iran for oil expertise. It has built a parallel financial system to bypass US sanctions. And now, it is sending a message to the we are not going anywhere. But there's more. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader geopolitical chessboard. The exited geopolitical a new Cold War in Latin America. Let's out for a moment. What we're seeing in Venezuela isn't an isolated crisis, it's a microcosm of the new Cold War playing out between the US, China, and Russia. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the CIA-backed coups, the drug wars, the economic exploitation, all of it was predicated on the idea that Washington could dictate the region's politics. But that era is ending. China is now the largest trading partner for most of Latin America. Russia is supplying arms and energy deals. And countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia are openly defying US hegemony. This is the real story behind Venezuela's election. Maduro isn't just fighting for his political survival, he's fighting for a multipolar world order. And he's not alone. Let's look at the 1. China. Beijing has poured billions into Venezuela, investing in oil, infrastructure, and technology. It has also provided financial lifelines, helping Caracas evade US sanctions. In return, Venezuela has become a key node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, giving Beijing a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. 2. Russia. Moscow has been Maduro's most reliable military ally. Russian troops have been spotted in Venezuela, and Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil company, has helped keep Venezuela's energy sector afloat. More importantly, Russia sees Venezuela as a strategic counterweight to US influence in Latin America, just as it uses Syria in the Middle East. 3. Iran. Tehran has sent oil tankers to Venezuela, helping it bypass US sanctions. Iranian engineers have worked to revive Venezuela's refineries. And just last year, Iran and Venezuela signed a 20-year cooperation agreement, deepening their economic and military ties. 4. The US. Washington's policy toward Venezuela has been a study in failure. Sanctions have devastated the economy but failed to topple Maduro. The 2019 coup attempt, backed by the US, collapsed in humiliation. And now, with the election, the US is left with few options, none of them good. This is the new Venezuela is no longer a US client state. It is a battleground in a global struggle for influence. And here's the Maduro knows this. That's why his post-election moves were so calculated. By offering negotiations, he's forcing the US to choose between two bad: either recognize his government or double down on regime change. But the US isn't the only one with skin in the game. Because if Venezuela falls, the dominoes start to tip. Military and strategic, the unthinkable is now possible. Let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America. From Guatemala in 1954 to Chile in 1973 to AMA in 1989, Washington has never hesitated to use force when it felt its interests were threatened. And Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves and strategic location, is a prime target. But here's a US military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. First, the logistics. Venezuela is a large country with a population of 28 million. It has a standing army of 120,000 soldiers, plus tens of thousands of militia members. The terrain is difficult: jungles, mountains, and urban sprawl. And unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, Venezuela has powerful allies. Russia has already warned that any US attack on Venezuela would be met with a response. China, too, would likely react, perhaps by increasing its military presence in the region. Second, the political fallout. A U.S. invasion of Venezuela would be deeply unpopular in Latin America. Even governments that oppose Maduro, like Brazil and Mexico, would likely condemn it. And in the U.S., it would be a political nightmare. The American public is war-weary. The last thing they want is another endless conflict in a country most of them couldn't find on a map. Third, the economic consequences. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world. If the U.S. invades, Maduro could sabotage the oil fields, sending global prices skyrocketing. And if Russia or Iran retaliate, say, by cutting off oil exports or attacking U.S. allies in the Middle East, the economic damage could be catastrophic. Now, I'm not saying a U.S. invasion is imminent. But the fact that we're even talking about it shows how desperate the situation has become. Because the alternative, accepting Maduro's victory, is also unacceptable to Washington. This is the trap the U.S. has built for itself. It has no good options left. And that's exactly what Maduro wants. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Let's bring this back to the U.S. for a moment. Because Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy issue, it's a domestic political one. For the Biden administration, Venezuela is a lose-lose situation. If they recognize Maduro, they'll be accused of appeasing a dictator. If they double down on regime change, they risk another foreign policy failure. And with the 2024 election looming, neither option is appealing. But here's the Venezuela is a wedge issue in U.S. politics. For the Republican base, it's a symbol of everything wrong with the world: socialism, authoritarianism, anti-Americanism. For the Democratic base, it's a reminder of the failures of U.S. interventionism. And for swing voters in Florida, where the Venezuelan diaspora is a powerful voting bloc, it's a personal issue. This is why the Biden administration has been so inconsistent on Venezuela. They've kept some of Trump's sanctions in place, but they've also allowed limited oil exports to resume. They've condemned Maduro, but they've also engaged in back-channel negotiations. They're trying to thread the needle, but the needle is getting smaller by the day. And here's the Maduro knows this. He knows that the U.S. is politically divided, that its attention is elsewhere, and that its options are running out. That's why he's playing the long game. Because in the end, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of U.S. power in Latin America. Scenario: what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, Maduro and the opposition reach a power-sharing agreement. The US and EU recognize the election results in exchange for concessions, perhaps a new election in a few years, or a role for the opposition in government. Sanctions are eased, and Venezuela slowly reintegrates into the global economy. This is the best-case scenario. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because neither side trusts the other. The opposition wants Maduro gone. Maduro wants to stay in power. And the US doesn't want to legitimize his government. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. The US and its allies refuse to recognize Maduro, but they don't take military action. Sanctions remain in place, but they're not tightened. Venezuela continues to sell oil to China and Russia, and the economy stabilizes at a low level. The opposition remains in exile, and Maduro rules through repression. This is the status quo. It's not pretty, but it's stable for now. Scenario 3, the escalation. In this scenario, the US and its allies double down. Sanctions are tightened. Covert operations increase. The opposition launches a new wave of protests, and the government cracks down. Russia and China respond by increasing their support for Maduro. And at some point, the US is forced to make either back down or escalate. This is the most dangerous scenario. Because once you start down this path, it's hard to turn back. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the bigger what does Venezuela tell us about the future of US power? For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image. Through military force, economic pressure, and political influence, it has sought to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights. This is what scholars call liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should be the world's policeman. But here's the it's not working. Look at the last 20 years. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. The Arab Spring led to chaos, not democracy. The color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia have left those countries in perpetual crisis. And now, in Latin America, the US is losing influence to China and Russia. Venezuela is just the latest example. The US tried to overthrow Maduro through sanctions, coups, and covert operations. It failed. And now, it's left with either accept defeat or escalate into a conflict it can't win. This is the pattern of empire decline. The British Empire tried to hold on to its colonies in the 20th century. It failed. The Soviet Union tried to maintain its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It collapsed. And now, the US is trying to hold on to its global dominance, but the world is moving on. The question: how long can the US keep this up? Because the longer it tries to maintain its hegemony, the more it will overstretch itself. The more it will alienate its allies. And the more it will risk catastrophic wars. Alternatives: and what should we do instead? So what's the alternative? If liberal hegemony is failing, what should the US do instead? Here's my controversial: the US should accept a multipolar world. That doesn't mean abandoning its allies or retreating into isolationism. It means recognizing that the world is changing, and that the US can't control everything. It means focusing on its core interests: security, prosperity, and stability, and letting other countries find their own path. In the case of Venezuela, that 1. Engaging with Maduro, the US should drop its regime change policy and start negotiating. That doesn't mean endorsing his government, but it does mean accepting that he's not going anywhere. 2. Easing sanctions. Sanctions haven't worked. They've hurt the Venezuelan people, not the government. The US should lift them in exchange for concessions, like free elections in the future. 3. Working with regional partners, the US should coordinate with Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, not to isolate Venezuela, but to engage with it. These countries have more influence in Caracas than Washington does. 4. Focusing on migration, the Venezuelan crisis has sent millions of refugees into neighboring countries. The US should work with those countries to manage the flow, rather than using it as a political weapon. This isn't appeasement. It's realism. And it's the only way to avoid a wider conflict. Reflective: the signal we're missing. Let me leave you with this thought. Venezuela's election wasn't just about who won. It was a signal, a message to the world that the old order is changing. The US can no longer dictate the politics of Latin America. China and Russia are here to stay. And countries like Venezuela are finding new ways to survive. The question: will we listen? Because if we don't, we're going to keep making the same mistakes. We're going to keep overreaching. We're going to keep failing. And in the end, we're going to wake up in a world where the US is no longer the sole superpower and where our options are far more limited than we think. This isn't about Maduro. It's about the future of global power. And if we don't understand that, we're going to be blindsided by the next crisis, and the one after that. The signal has been sent. The question: are we paying attention? Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just a diplomatic headache, it's a military wake-up call. And if we're not careful, we're going to misread it as a local problem when it's actually a preview of how the next global conflict will unfold. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard, assuming that economic pressure and occasional covert ops would be enough to keep governments in line. But Venezuela has just proven that this playbook is obsolete. And the reason? The rules of the game have changed, not just politically, but militarily. Take the recent joint naval exercises between Venezuela, Russia, and China in the Caribbean. In July 2024, the Russian frigate Admiral Gorshkov and the Chinese destroyer Zibo conducted drills with the Venezuelan Navy near Margarita Island. That's not just a show of force, it's a statement. For the first time since the Cold War, we're seeing a sustained Russian and Chinese military presence in what the US has long considered its maritime sphere of influence. And unlike the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, this isn't a one-off standoff. It's a slow, deliberate encroachment. Here's the uncomfortable: the US Navy hasn't had to seriously contest control of the Caribbean since the Spanish-American War. But now, with Russia and China establishing logistical hubs in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, we're looking at a fundamental shift. The Admiral Gorshkov isn't just any ship, it's armed with hypersonic Zircon missiles, capable of striking targets at 6,000 kilometers per hour with little warning. That's not a weapon you deploy for symbolic reasons. That's a weapon you deploy to deter US intervention. And it's not just about hardware. It's about doctrine. For years, the Pentagon has assumed that in any conflict with China, the US would dominate the Western Pacific. But what if the next war isn't fought in the South China Sea? What if it's fought in the Caribbean, where Chinese and Russian forces can operate from friendly territory, just 1,500 miles from Florida? That changes everything. Let me put this in perspective. During the 2020 Belarus protests, when Russia sent mercenaries to prop up Lukashenko, the US responded with sanctions and moral outrage. But when Russia and China do the same in Venezuela, arming Maduro, training his forces, and embedding their own military personnel, the response has been muted. Why? Because the US is already stretched thin. Ukraine is draining resources. Taiwan is a ticking clock. The Middle East is a powder keg. And now, suddenly, the US Southern Command is sounding alarms about Russian and Chinese military activity in its own hemisphere. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the erosion of US deterrence. For decades, the implicit threat of military intervention was enough to keep Latin American governments in check. But now, with Russia and China offering security guarantees, that threat is losing its bite. And once that happens, the floodgates open. Nicaragua is already deepening ties with Moscow. Bolivia is flirting with Chinese military bases. Even traditionally US-aligned countries like Brazil and Mexico are hedging their bets, refusing to fully isolate Caracas. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of a Caribbean Cold War. But I am saying that the US is losing its ability to shape outcomes in its own neighborhood. And that's a problem, because history shows that when great powers lose control of their periphery, they start making reckless decisions. Take the Falklands War in 1982. Britain had been neglecting its South Atlantic territories for years, assuming Argentina wouldn't dare invade. Then, when it did, London was caught flat-footed. The result? A war that could have been avoided with a little foresight. Now, fast forward to today. The US has spent the last 20 years focused on the Middle East and Asia, assuming Latin America would take care of itself. But what happens when a crisis erupts, say, a Chinese military base in Nicaragua, or a Russian-backed coup in AMA, and the US is too distracted to respond? That's the scenario we should be preparing for. And yet, instead of adapting, Washington is doubling down on the same failed strategies. Sanctions that don't work. Regime change fantasies that backfire. And a military posture that assumes the US can still project power anywhere, anytime, without consequence. Let me be, I'm not advocating for war. I'm advocating for realism. The US can't afford to treat Latin America as an afterthought anymore. Not when Russia and China are turning it into a battleground for influence. Not when Venezuela is proving that defiance has no consequences. And not when the next crisis could be just one miscalculation away. So what's the solution? First, the US needs to accept that military intervention in Venezuela is off the table. The days of Operation Just Cause are over. Second, it needs to rebuild relationships with regional partners, not as junior allies, but as equals. Brazil isn't going to follow Washington's lead just because we ask nicely. We have to offer them something in return. Third, the US needs to rethink its military posture in the hemisphere. That means more surveillance, more deterrence, and yes, more engagement with countries like Venezuela, even if we don't like their governments. Because here's the signal Venezuela just sent isn't just about Maduro. It's about the end of US hegemony in Latin America. And if we don't start paying attention, we're going to wake up one day and realize that the rules of the game have changed and we're no longer the ones writing them. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just a foreign policy headache for Washington, it's a domestic political earthquake for the regime itself. Maduro's decision to hold this referendum, to double down on the Essequibo claim, wasn't just about rallying international attention. It was about survival. And if we don't understand the internal dynamics at play here, we're going to misread the next move entirely. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is a shell of what it once was. Oil production, which once topped 3.5 million barrels a day in the late 1990s, now hovers around 700,000, less than half of what it was when Maduro took power in 2013. Inflation, which hit a mind-boggling 1 million% in 2018, has stabilized only because the government effectively dollarized parts of the economy, allowing transactions in U.S. currency. But that's not a sign of strength, it's a sign of desperation. The bolivar is so worthless that even street vendors refuse it. The minimum wage? About $3.50 a month. That's not a typo. $3.50 a month. So how does a regime like this stay in power? The answer is repression, co-optation, and distraction. Repression is the most obvious. Since 2014, Venezuela's security forces have arrested over 15,000 political prisoners, according to Foro Penal, a local human rights group. The UN's fact-finding mission on Venezuela has documented systematic torture, extrajudicial killings, and enforced disappearances. The colectivos, armed pro-government militias, act as a parallel security force, intimidating opposition figures and controlling neighborhoods. Then there's the co-optation. The military, which controls everything from food distribution to oil exports, has been bought off. High-ranking officers run state-owned enterprises, smuggle gasoline, and profit from gold mining in the south. The message is: if you play ball, you eat. If you don't, you disappear. But repression and co-optation only go so far. That's where distraction comes in. And that's why the Essequibo gambit is so critical. Maduro knows his approval ratings are in the toilet. A Dataanalysis poll from October 2023 put his support at just 18%. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, a hardline anti-Chavista who won the primary in October with over 90% of the vote, poses a real threat. The regime has already barred her from running in next year's presidential election, but that hasn't stopped her from mobilizing massive crowds. In November, she drew tens of thousands to rallies across the country. The government's response? Arrest her campaign manager, freeze her assets, and now, pivot to nationalism. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just posturing for the international community. He's posturing for his own people. The Essequibo referendum wasn't about Guyana. It was about giving Venezuelans something to rally around: a cause, a grievance, a sense of pride. The regime has spent years telling its citizens that their problems are the fault of the US, the oligarchs, the imperialists. Now, it's adding Guyana to the list. The timing isn't coincidental. The referendum was held on December 3, just weeks after Machado's primary victory. The message to Venezuelans? Forget about elections. Forget about the economy. Your real enemy is out there, across the border. But here's the thing about nationalists: they're a double-edged sword. On one hand, they can buy time. Look at Argentina's Falklands War in 1982. A military junta on the brink of collapse launched a doomed invasion of the islands, and for a few months, it worked. The streets were filled with flag-waving crowds. The generals bought themselves a little breathing room. But when the war was lost, the regime collapsed anyway. Nationalism is a drug. It gives you a high, but the crash is brutal. Maduro is playing the same game, but with a twist. He's not just rallying the base, he's testing the waters for something bigger. The referendum wasn't just about claiming the Essequibo. It was about gauging how far he can push without provoking a real response. The fact that the US and Guyana have responded with military exercises and sanctions, but no direct confrontation, tells him he can go further. And that's dangerous. Let me lay out the scenarios. The most likely outcome in the short term is that Maduro will keep escalating rhetorically but stop short of actual military action. He'll send troops to the border, maybe even stage a few provocative exercises, but he won't invade. Why? Because he knows that if he does, he risks losing everything. Guyana has the backing of the US, the UK, and Brazil. Even Russia and China, which have been happy to prop up Maduro with loans and oil deals, aren't going to risk a war over a territorial dispute that doesn't directly benefit them. Maduro's goal isn't to conquer the Essequibo. It's to create a permanent crisis that keeps his people distracted and his opponents off balance. But there's a second scenario, and it's the one that keeps me up at night. What if Maduro miscalculates? What if he thinks he can take a small slice of the Essequibo, say, the town of Ancocco Island, which Venezuela already controls de facto, and get away with it? That's the kind of limited incursion that could spiral out of control. The US has made it clear that it will defend Guyana's territorial integrity. If Venezuelan troops cross the border, even in a limited way, the pressure on Washington to respond will be immense. And that's when things get messy. The third scenario is the most interesting and the most overlooked. What if Maduro's real goal isn't the Essequibo at all, but something else entirely? What if this is all a prelude to a power play within the regime? The Venezuelan military is not a monolith. There are factions, some loyal to Maduro, others to Diosdado Cabello, the powerful National Assembly president, and others still who are quietly aligning with the opposition. A crisis like this could be the perfect excuse for Maduro to purge rivals, consolidate power, and declare a state of emergency. We've seen this movie before. In 2017, Maduro used protests as an excuse to dissolve the National Assembly and create a new constituent assembly packed with loyalists. In 2018, he used a drone attack on a military parade to justify a crackdown on dissidents. The Essequibo could be the next Pret. So where does that leave us? The US and its allies need to be very careful about how they respond. The worst thing they could do is overreact. If Washington starts talking about military options or regime change, it plays right into Maduro's hands. It gives him the external enemy he needs to justify repression at home. But the second worst thing they could do is underreact. If the US and Guyana don't draw clear red lines, Maduro will keep pushing, and the next crisis could be much worse. Here's what should happen. First, the US needs to work with Brazil and Colombia to de-escalate the situation. Lula, despite his leftist credentials, has no interest in seeing a war on his border. He's already offered to mediate. The US should let him take the lead. Second, the US needs to make it clear to Maduro that while it won't tolerate military aggression, it's also willing to talk. That means offering sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions, free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and an end to the harassment of the opposition. It's not about rewarding Maduro. It's about giving him a way out. Third, the US needs to prepare for the possibility that this isn't just about the Essequibo. If Maduro is using this crisis to consolidate power, the opposition is going to need support. That means more funding for independent media, more pressure on the regime to allow international observers for next year's election, and more engagement with the military to peel off potential defectors. The opposition has momentum right now. The US needs to make sure that momentum doesn't get crushed under the weight of nationalist hysteria. Because here's the Maduro isn't invincible. His regime is brittle. The economy is a house of cards. The military is loyal only as long as the money keeps flowing. And the people are exhausted. The Essequibo gambit is a sign of weakness, not strength. It's the move of a leader who knows his time is running out. The question is whether the US and its allies are smart enough to exploit that weakness without making it worse. One thing is, the old playbook isn't going to work. Sanctions alone won't bring Maduro down. Military threats will only make him dig in. And ignoring the problem will ensure that the next crisis is even bigger. Venezuela is at a crossroads. The Essequibo dispute is just the first act. The real drama is what comes in, and if we don't start paying attention, we're going to miss the most important part. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's Essequibo gambit isn't just about territory, it's about legacy. The man is staring down the barrel of history, and he knows it. Since Chávez's death in 2013, Venezuela's socialist experiment has been a slow-motion collapse, but Maduro has clung to power through a combination of repression, economic mismanagement, and sheer luck. The problem for him is that luck runs out. The 2018 election was a farce, the 2020 parliamentary vote was a sham, and the 2024 presidential election, scheduled for next July, is shaping up to be his last stand. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has momentum. She won the primary in October 2023 with 92% of the vote, despite the regime's best efforts to disqualify her. The streets are restless. The military is divided. And the economy? Well, let's just say that when your inflation rate hits 234% in a single year, as it did in 2023, even your most loyal generals start asking questions about their Swiss bank accounts. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't trying to win a war over the Essequibo. He's trying to avoid losing an election. The referendum on December 3 wasn't about annexing territory, it was about manufacturing a crisis to justify postponing or canceling the vote. Think about it. The timing is too perfect. The opposition is surging. The economy is in freefall. The military is restless. And suddenly, Maduro has a national emergency to distract from his own failures. It's classic authoritarian playbook stuff: create an external threat to rally the population, crack down on dissent, and buy time. The problem is that this playbook only works if the world plays along. And right now, the world isn't cooperating. Let me explain why this matters for U.S. grand strategy. For the past decade, Washington's approach to Venezuela has been a mix of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and half-hearted support for regime change. The Trump administration took the hardest line, imposing sweeping economic sanctions in 2019 and recognizing Juan Guaidó as interim president. The Biden administration has been slightly more pragmatic, easing some sanctions in exchange for limited concessions, like the 2023 Barbados Agreement, which promised free and fair elections in 2024. But neither approach has worked. Maduro is still in power. The economy is still a disaster. And the opposition is still fighting for survival. The reason? Because the U.S. has treated Venezuela as a problem to be solved, not a crisis to be managed. And that's a mistake. Venezuela isn't Cuba. It's not North Korea. It's a country with deep ties to the U.S., a massive diaspora, and an economy that, despite everything, still matters. The U.S. imports about 70,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, down from over 1 million in the 1990s, but still enough to make a difference in global markets. Venezuela's collapse has sent millions of migrants to the U.S. border, straining resources and fueling political tensions. And let's not forget the geopolitical stakes. Russia and China have both deepened their ties to Caracas in recent years, with Moscow sending military advisors and Beijing providing loans and investment. If the U.S. wants to counter Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America, it can't afford to ignore Venezuela. So what's the alternative? First, the U.S. needs to stop treating Venezuela as a binary problem: either Maduro goes, or nothing changes. That's not how authoritarian regimes fall. They collapse when their internal contradictions become too great to manage, and when the international community gives them a way out. The U.S. should be working with Brazil, Colombia, and the EU to create a roadmap for a negotiated transition. That means offering sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions, free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and the return of exiled opposition leaders. It means engaging with the military, not just to peel off defectors, but to ensure that any transition doesn't descend into chaos. And it means preparing for the possibility that Maduro might not go quietly. Second, the U.S. needs to stop outsourcing its Venezuela policy to Florida. For too long, U.S. policy toward Venezuela has been driven by domestic politics, with Cuban-American and Venezuelan-American lobby groups pushing for a hardline approach. That's understandable, these communities have suffered under Maduro's rule. But foreign policy can't be made in Miami. It has to be made in Washington, with an eye toward long-term stability, not short-term political gain. The Biden administration's decision to ease some sanctions in 2023 was a step in the right direction, but it was also a half measure. The U.S. needs to go further, offering Maduro a clear off-ramp, one that includes sanctions relief, diplomatic recognition, and a path to reintegration into the global economy. That doesn't mean rewarding Maduro. It means giving him a reason to step aside. Third, the U.S. needs to prepare for the possibility that the Essequibo crisis isn't over. Maduro's referendum was a warning shot, not a declaration of war. But if he feels cornered, he might escalate. That could mean sending troops into the disputed territory, or it could mean something more subtle like sabotaging Guyana's oil infrastructure or stirring up unrest among the indigenous population. The U.S. needs to be ready for all of these scenarios. That means working with Guyana to bolster its defenses, without provoking Maduro into a reckless move. It means keeping the door open for diplomacy, even as it prepares for the worst. And it means making it clear to Maduro that while the U.S. won't tolerate military aggression, it's also willing to talk. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not about winning every battle. It's about positioning yourself to win the war. And right now, the U.S. is in a strong position. Maduro is weak. The opposition is united. The region is aligned. The question is whether the U.S. has the patience and the vision to see this through. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change, hasn't worked. It's time for a new approach. One that recognizes that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro. It's about the future of democracy in Latin America. And that's a fight worth having. Let me leave you with this. In 1989, the U.S. watched as the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. It wasn't because of U.S. sanctions or military pressure. It was because the system was rotten, and the people knew it. Venezuela is not the Soviet Union. But the lesson is the same. Authoritarian regimes don't fall because of outside pressure. They fall because they lose the support of their own people. Maduro knows that. That's why he's desperate. That's why he's lashing out. And that's why the U.S. needs to be smart enough to let him fail, without making the same mistakes it did in Iraq, Libya, or Syria. The Essequibo dispute is just the beginning. The real drama is what comes in, and if we don't start paying attention, we're going to miss the most important part.